Dr. Shafia F. Muhibat, Deputy Executive Director of Research, CSIS Indonesia. Associate Professor Dr. Leonard C. Sebastian, Coordinator of Indonesian Program at RSIS Singapore. Dr. Lina Alexandra, Senior Researcher and Head of the Department of International Relations at CSIS Indonesia. Dr. Yayan Ganda Hayat Mulyana, Head of the Foreign Policy Strategy Agency at the Indonesian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Dr. Sylvia Yazid, Lecturer in the International Relations Department at the Catholic University of Parahyangan. I would like to also extend my greetings to our speakers today, the contributors of the book, Ms. Halida Nuriah Hatta, Mr. Muhammad Arif, Dr. Ardhitya Eduard Yeremia, Dr. Randi Wirasta Nandyatama, and Dr. Fitriani. Thank you for joining us today. Before we start the session, I would like to announce that today's event is the book launching of Hatta and Indonesia's Independent and Active Foreign Policy, Retrospect and Prospect, edited by Evan Alaksmana and Lina Alexandra. This book gathers a dozen of rising scholars and analysts of the Indonesian foreign policy to examine the condition and extent to which the independent and active principle, which was first articulated by Vice President Muhammad Hatta in 1948, has been used and abused in various strategy policy issues. This event will be opened with a welcoming remark from Dr. Shafia F. Muhibat as the Deputy Executive Director for Research of CSIS Indonesia, followed by an opening remark from Dr. Leonard C. Sebastian as the Coordinator of Indonesian Program at RSIS Singapore. On to the next agenda is the book discussion by our speakers today, Ms. Halida Nuriah Hatta, Mr. Muhammad Arif, Dr. Ardhitya Eduard Yeremia, Dr. Randi Wirasta Nandyatama, and Dr. Fitriani. The discussants in this session are Dr. Yayan Ganda Hayat Mulyana and Dr. Sylvia Yazid, and this session will be moderated by Dr. Lina Alexandra. At last, we will have a ceremonial book handover and a photo session. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Shafia F. Muhibat to give her welcoming remarks through Zoom. Dr. Fifi, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. I hope my voice is loud and clear at the auditorium. Today, a very good morning to all of our distinguished speakers, authors of the book, and also participants joining us today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's book launch and discussion. Today, we will officially launch and discuss the Hatta and Indonesia's Independent and Active Foreign Policy, Retrospect and Prospect. I think this book has been in the process for quite some time, and I'm very pleased that today we can finally officially launch the book. I would like to thank, first of all, our partners from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, especially Associate Professor Dr. Leonard Sebastian. So good to see you this morning, Pak Leonard, who have provided generous support to make this book and the whole process of writing the book possible. So thank you so much, Pak Leonard. I would like to also kindly welcome Dr. Yayan Ganda Hayat Mulyana from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Dr. Sylvia Yazid from Parahyangan Catholic University, who have both kindly accepted our invitation to be the discussants for today's event. I also wish to welcome and show my greatest appreciation to all the authors of this book who will also be speaking in today's discussion. Those who are joining us at the CSIS auditorium, I think we have Ibu Halida Nuriah Hatta and Dr. Ardhitya Yeremia. And those joining us virtually, I think we have Dr. Randi Nandyatama, Muhammad Arif, and Dr. Fitriani. Thank you again for your contribution to the book. I think this is a very special occasion that we will discuss the core values of Indonesian foreign policy. Back in 1948, the then Prime Minister Muhammad Hatta enacted the idea for Indonesia to be both independent and active in interacting with other countries. Especially, given the context at the time, it was facing great division caused by the beginning of the Cold War. The principle has been cherished as Indonesia's foreign policy doctrine until now. No other foreign policy doctrine has been able to replace the great idea of Muhammad Hatta. But now we also see that the world we are living now has done tremendous change. Comparing 1948 to now 2022 is absolutely completely different. Internationally, we are seeing phenomena that present new opportunities and new challenges. Domestically in Indonesia, there are also domestic challenges. Transforming into a full-fledged democracy, aspiring to become a middle and regional power, and also still striving to contribute in shaping the global order. And I think with such changes, with different dynamics that we have now, I think it's timely that we revisit again, to what extent Indonesia's independent and active principles remain relevant in helping guide the country to pursue its foreign policy for its national interests, as well as promoting regional and international peace and stability. Therefore, CSIS is pleased to have collaborated with RSIS to publish this book. And I think this book, with excellent contributions from the bright minds and future Indonesian foreign policy experts, seeks to answer a few things, but I think most of all is how the independent and active principles were reflected and used in many critical junctures and issues that Indonesia as a country has had to face. Hopefully, the book could stimulate further discussion on these issues. Basically for the doctrine to be alive and to be relevant, rather than just simply being a slogan. And by organizing this discussion event today, CSIS also hopes that we can provide insights to policymakers as well as to the general public to further flesh out Indonesia's foreign policy, especially amidst the very high demand to the country to play a more active role in the world stage. This year, Indonesia is president of the G20. Next year, we are assuming the ASEAN chairmanship. So many very high expectation is directed at Indonesia at the moment. And I think this calls for very further discussion on the issue. And lastly, again, I congratulate all the authors, but especially I congratulate the editors of this book, Dr. Evan Laksmana and Dr. Lina Alexandra. Congratulations for having this book published today. And I look forward to a deep, meaningful and fruitful discussion. Thank you so much.
Ya, selamat siang Bapak, Ibu, dan rekan-rekan sekalian yang saya hormati. Sungguh sebuah kehormatan bagi saya untuk dapat hadir dan berpartisipasi di acara peluncuran buku Hatta and Indonesia's Independent and Active Foreign Policy, Retrospect and Prospect. Saya juga sangat bangga mendapatkan kesempatan untuk ikut bertukar pikiran dengan generasi baru atau generasi muda, para pemikir-pemikir hubungan internasional Indonesia di forum ini. What a great honor it is for me to be present, and terima kasih banyak Pak Rizal dan Ibu Fifi atas undangan Anda for me to attend this wonderful gathering of superb, brilliant scholars who are going to share their thoughts on Indonesia's foreign policy, giving us a good idea as to how to best operationalize the bebas aktif foreign policy principle so long ago articulated by Bung Hatta back in 1948, but of course made famous through an article in the journal Foreign Affairs. I want to also take this opportunity to thank the Foreign Minister, Ibu Retno, for taking the time to endorse this book. Also, we must express our great and sincere gratitude to Ibu Halida, Nuriah, Hatta for sharing her family's experiences and her experience with her magnificent father, one of the founding fathers of post-independence Indonesia. And just to share a little bit about his thinking during the workshop that we had prior to the putting together of this volume. My thanks also to Dr. Lina Alexandra and Dr. Evan Laxmana for working so hard, to bring everybody together and to put in all the effort to edit such a coherent volume. It's a lot of work, actually, putting together an edited volume. And I thank them for their painstaking effort and hard work. I want to thank also my colleague, Dr. Adi Priya Marziki, who was such a big help here at RSIS in terms of doing all the coordination work and helping to work out the proposal and help us in terms of putting together the support base for the workshop. And of course, my thanks extends to all the paper writers who've produced a brilliant volume here for us to reflect upon and think more clearly about the uses of bebas aktif. What does bebas aktif mean in this day and age? And I believe, we'll get a snippet of it during our seminar today as the various paper writers give their insights on how we look at bebas aktif from a contemporary geopolitical dynamic, looking at the geopolitical as well as looking at the geopolitical dynamic from both the current situation as well as the challenges we see in this day and age. Looking at the historical processes that related to bebas aktif and its contemporary applications over the course of the years through some useful and interesting case studies. I do believe because there are one or two case studies there that I've myself personally have never come across, especially the study on the Wahid years. Also, we need to think in terms of the current application of bebas aktif and how the book will help us understand better the dynamic as it is applied to the foreign policy principle. In this regard, I think it'll be very useful for us to look at it from two different perspectives. I've tried to apply Western theory to bebas aktif, and I've always found it challenging. And I understand why it is challenging, because non-Western approaches follow horizontal thought patterns, whereas Western theory is very much a vertical pattern, because Western theory is drawn very much from Greek tradition. So in a sense, what I like about non-Western theory is that it allows us to look at it, to look at issues utilizing past, present, and future, which I think is very interesting for scenario planning and very useful for policy relevant research. Also, in this context, vertical thinking is, as we see in Western universities, also inhibits the incorporation of policy relevant research into any international relations agenda. There's a lot of resistance towards policy relevant work. And I think what we must try to do, and I hope what this book does, is it helps to integrate the process well, to help us understand how a theoretical concept, which is what bebas aktif is, if you look at it in its actuality, how it is then applied through the process of foreign policy formulation. And its relevance is still very significant in this day and age. I've just been working on some research on Indonesia's responses to the Ukraine-Russia war, right, in in the Indo-Pacific, and looking at Indonesia's approach towards it in the context of the G20. And it's fascinating to see Bebas Aktif at work, in that dynamic. So let me now hand the floor over back to the ones who should be our focus for today, the speakers. And of course, I want to wish everybody a wonderful and an enjoyable seminar, and one that we can draw much insight and perspective on this marvelous concept that is enduring in the Indonesian foreign policy dynamic. Thank you.
Thank you for your insightful remarks, Dr. Leonard. We have now come to the beginning of today's book discussion. This session will be moderated by Dr. Lina Alexandra. She is the head of the Department of International Relations at CSIS. Without taking more of your time, I invite Dr. Lina to start the session. Dr. Lina, the floor is yours.
Good morning once again, and welcome to the book launch today on Hatta and Indonesia's Independent and Active Foreign Policy, Retrospect and Prospect. I'm very grateful today that we can gather here and finally see this book after so much tedious work that we have done to finally compile the articles and also edit the book itself. And also I would like to thank Pak Hasan Wirayuda, Pak Umar Hadi, Excellencies, and all the participants here for joining us this morning. As the co-editor of this book with Dr. Evan Laksmana, allow me to share some of the experience, the idea why we are having this initiative to create this book project, how the idea of this project came about. Basically, me and Evan were intrigued with the need to explain about Indonesia's foreign policy in a different way. Because what we have seen so far, most of existing analysis about Indonesia's foreign policy are mostly explaining one particular segment of the foreign policy trajectory, mostly also through the idiosyncratic lens. What I mean is why certain policy is implemented or is done in certain way is because there's a particular leader, because the few of particular leader that run the country at that time. Nothing wrong with this angle or this perspective. But what we think is largely missing in this analysis is the examination as to what extent our foreign policy has been truly guided by the principles of independent and active. What we recognize as Indonesia's foreign policy doctrine. What comes to our sense as young people, this independent and active has unfortunately become rather a slogan rather than a doctrine. It has been repeatedly mentioned in the rhetorics, but not necessarily or clearly reflected by our foreign policy makers when they formulated foreign policy. Therefore, we think it is very timely to look into this independent active principle again. And how is it relevant up until now, 77 years after the independence of our country? Two major questions that we put in this book. First, how have Indonesian foreign policy makers thought about and implemented the independent active principle across different external challenges? What lessons can we learn from the past? Second, how relevant is the independent active foreign policy principle for Indonesia today as Indonesia confronts new and emerging strategic challenges ahead? Also, to make another difference, I think Dr. Fifi already mentioned also in the beginning that we present here in the book the perspective, the views from the next generations, from the young and bright minds of Indonesian foreign policy experts who have kindly contributed to this book. And in this book, as you can see in your hand, we have 10 authors. And one of them, we are very privileged to have Ibu Halida Hatta, who also contributed a piece in this book, which really makes a difference into the book compared to the other foreign policy book, Ibu. Thank you so much. And we also have some of the, I think all the speakers are here in the Zoom, but because of the time wise, we only can invite few to share some of the key points of their articles in the book. So without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker, the first author, Ibu Halida, to speak. Each speaker will have around 5 to 7 minutes just to summarize, to highlight the key points of the articles, because definitely others can enjoy more while reading the book. Just so this will be a teaser, Ibu, to the book itself. So now I would like to give the floor to Ibu Halida to speak. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Lina, and distinguished guests. I see here Pak Menlu, and then Hasan Wirayuda, and then Pak Duta Besar Umar Hadi, Ambassador, the scholars, of course. I'm so happy that I was asked to be participating as to contribute one article. The specific question by CSIS is actually it is intriguing. You want to know why Hatta could come up with the independent and active foreign policy. What was in his life actually that he could come up with this concept? And so I tried to gather my recollection of my father's work and then the daily life with him, and to see the principle. Hatta is a man of principle, and he always started with a concept. From his youth time, actually, he started everything with the balancing between the logic and also the speak from the heart. And that's why philosophy becomes very important in his life and in his writings. And actually, it is not only that he wrote something, but he implemented in his daily life. And so I tried to find some words, some key points, some keywords that went through our life. So it is like how he actually wanted very much to have to see and to witness and to encourage people, Indonesian people, to have dignity and then to believe in what he does, what she does, and then to have to acknowledge the inner power, the strength that we as a nation have. And the colonialism that he experienced in his youth time, it made him determination that Indonesia should be an independent country, independent nation, and what he as a person could contribute for make the dream of independent nation become true, materialized. And so I just make try to cultivate some keywords that we experience, like the word inlander. It is actually the terminology that is to undermine the Indonesian people during the Dutch colonial time. And then he really wanted our mentality, the Indonesian mentality, to push away the terminology of inlander. One should have a strength, power, and to have a national identity, which is a country, a nation with a strong determination. And so that determination is actually transformed into the independent and active policy, because during that time, domestic affairs was in turbulent somehow. In the committee of the representative. It is like now we see it like a parliament, but at that time it was not a parliament. After the election, it was before the election. Indonesia was only for 3 years after independence, and then the domestic affairs, some political elements favored the bloc, the Soviet bloc, and some may have looked up to the Western bloc. And then Hatta spoke in front of the committee to really have a solid ground, and then to see what our determination is, that to be a sovereign country, to get a sovereignty, and then to have a national identity, in the sense that we want peace, we want happiness. That is what he already tried to bring it about with his political struggle movement. That is to make Indonesia become an independent nation, and to pursue happiness, and then be friendly with other nations. But then we have our identity and our strong will to make peace. I think that is the essence of why he really wanted to, because of his political movement, is to make Indonesia happy, Indonesian people happy, and have a dignity in what we do as a nation. That's I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibu. I think that's very important to share with us the personal touch, definitely about the terminologies that you experience with your father, about which definitely envision Indonesia's foreign policy. And the word dignity, I think this is something very, very important, how Indonesia can really be independent and active. And this really brings dignity to our country. And now we have the second speaker, Dr. Yeremia Lalisang. And his article actually touch upon the issue of Indonesia-China relations, which often, I think, being pointed out by many spectators, saying Indonesia is not truly independent in dealing with China, for example. And I think his article will try to answer this kind of accusation or claim, whether it is true or not. Please, Dr. Yeremia, also 5 to 7 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lina Alexandra. First of all, I would like to say thanks to the organizers, especially CSIS Indonesia and RSIS, for organizing this very important book project. From the perspective of lecture in international relations, this book somehow simplify my duty as a lecturer, because when I teach Indonesian foreign policy, I just can distribute this book to my students and then ask them to read comprehensively all the chapters so that they can understand the essence of Indonesian foreign policy. Right now in Indonesia, there are more than, I believe there are more than 60 international relations undergraduate program, and there are around 8 postgraduate programs. So this book is very important in the development of international relations epistemic community in Indonesia. So thanks again for CSIS Indonesia and RSIS for organizing this book project. In my chapter, Dr. Klaus Ardhitya and I examine the extent to which Indonesia has maintained its commitment particularly to the bebas principle, to the independent principle, while engaging with China. So we look into 2 case studies. The first is the implementations of Jakarta-Bandung High-Speed Railway project. And then the second one is Jakarta's positions on the 2016 Tribunal Award. We find that Indonesia's commitment to independent principle is very dynamic, and it is not a simple expressions, or it cannot be regarded as a simply that we maintain bebas principles in our relations with China. We argue that Indonesia has to large extent maintains its commitment in the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway project in terms of how Jakarta has dealt with China in the negotiations process. So we argue that Jakarta has maintained how has somehow maintained the commitment to be the determining subject in defining how we should respond proposals from Japan and China. So as we know that Indonesia welcomed both proposals, and the Indonesian government set up some criteria to weigh the proposals, particularly from the financial structure perspective, and then from the commitment of China and Japan to technological transfers. We know that Indonesia eventually decides to partner with China in building the project. But yeah, to also show the commitment to the Bebas principle, Jakarta then sent signal to Tokyo that Jakarta was not in the positions to dedicate its high-speed railway market in Indonesia only to China. And the Indonesians even offered the Japanese another high-speed railway project linking Jakarta and Surabaya. However, Dr. Klaus and I also argued that Indonesia seemingly compromised its commitment during the project implementations phase. Yeah, as we know, in October 2021, President Jokowi issued a presidential regulations allowing the project to receive a loan guarantee or a capital injection from the state. This means that the governments failed to practice what it promised. The governments eventually channel or allowed to channel some portions of the state budget into what is designed as a business-to-business project. Although we do not have enough public evidence to conclude that Indonesia made such moves under the Chinese directives. However, we argue that the power asymmetry shaping Indonesia-China relations on the project was enough to exert pressure on Indonesia. So in this regard, we suggest that the government should make meticulous calculations in dealing with project with China, especially in the high-tech project in which China owns the technology, of course. So by making meticulous calculations, we do hope that the Indonesian governments minimize the risk of losing the ability to define and defend Indonesia's strategic interests. In the second case, we also found that the other way around, Indonesia seems to has strengthened its commitment to the Bebas principles. In the case of the South China Sea, Indonesia initially was quite reluctant to take bold stance against China. Jakarta only made normative and mild response to the 2016 UNCLOS tribunal. But Jakarta eventually took a more solid stance, quoting the award officially in its protest to China's violations to Indonesia's EEZ in Natunas in 2019, and into the diplomatic notes to the UN Secretary Generals. So in this regard, when its national interests and sovereign rights are at stake, Jakarta showed a commitment to be the determining subject. Despite its expanding bilateral economic exchanges with Beijing, Indonesia eventually upheld the 2016 tribunal award officially, a position which might upset Beijing, of course. So upholding the Bebas active principles, we argue Indonesia took side with the national interest, spoke the language of law and diplomacy instead of power, as well as eventually refused to be under direct or indirect pressures from any great powers in defining its positions on the 2016 tribunal award. So we argue that in the case of Indonesia's relations with the rising power, maintaining commitment to the Bebas active principle is not an easy matter. It's actually quite dynamic. So this case studies might provide some examples on how the dynamics of Indonesia maintain its commitment to the Bebas active principles. I think that's all from me, Dr. Lina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yeri. Of course, we can have a discussion later on whether we are convinced with the argument. But now we move to the the third speaker, who is Dr. Nandyatama, who is writing a chapter on assessing ASEAN centrality in Indonesia's foreign policy. I think this is very much relevant, especially as mentioned earlier, that Indonesia will chair ASEAN next year, and whether this aspect of ASEAN centrality can be really reflect the aspiration of Indonesia being independent and active. Please, Randy.
Thank you, Lina. First of all, I would like to share my screen. Okay. Hopefully you can see it clearly.
Yes.
Yes, okay, that's wonderful. First of all, I would like to thank CSIS Indonesia, especially Lina and Evan for being superb editors. And I would like to also thank RSIS, especially Pak Leonard, I'm a Pak, long time no see, for supporting this group like book project. I'm really grateful being one of the contributors in here. My chapter is about assessing ASEAN's centrality in Indonesian foreign policy. So basically, I would like to know and understand why Indonesia really focus on ASEAN and whether it's actually in line with bebas aktif, and what if we need to commit to initial idea of bebas aktif, what should we do? Okay, I have three issues in here, three points. The first one is about Indonesia's persistence in placing ASEAN. And second, and if we check how Indonesia uses ASEAN, whether it gives us benefit along with the idea of bebas aktif or not. And last but not least, how we should do. Look, Indonesia's persistence, I guess, in putting ASEAN as the cornerstone of our foreign policy, I argue that it makes us fall short of Hatta's ideal bebas aktif, because if you check and take a look at Hatta's initial idea, he somehow put a lot of important concepts, I guess. Take an example, the commitment of tackling global problems. And secondly, the idea of social justice. I think by focusing, especially during Suharto and after that, by focusing on ASEAN, has turned into a path dependent, despite the risk of watering down Jakarta's initial ideas. Oftentimes, our ideas got watered down, and because it has become path dependent for us. Indonesia elites, in fact, prolong this concept, the idea, the Cold War mentality, that Southeast Asia has a lot of flashpoints, and Jakarta's interest can only be safeguarded through ASEAN. Okay, and if we take a look at how Indonesia utilizes ASEAN, there are two cases in here that I would like to compare. The first one is when Indonesia responded to Cambodian crisis. In Jakarta back then adopted two-pronged approach, while Ministry of Foreign Affairs in line with ASEAN general stance. We could see that military, I guess, back then got closer with Vietnam. So there are two-pronged, Indonesian military visited even Vietnam several times. And what the result that we got, Jakarta got recognition from the conflicting parties. Indonesia back then got the status as the interlocutor of Vietnam, and Indonesia even hosted two Jakarta informal meetings, right? So I think it shows like by committing to ASEAN and beyond, it will give us more benefit. It highlighted Jakarta's involvement, commitment in creating regional peace and stability, aligning with Hatta's bebas aktif. However, if we take a look at with the case of ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, we see slight different condition in here. Against the backdrop of the rising tension between US and Jakarta, China and US, Jakarta suggested many ideas. I remember back then, Pak Menlu Marty suggested the treaty, Indo-Pacific treaty, but then Indonesia eventually decided to work within ASEAN to promote ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific in 2019. However, I see this has a slight problem because first we really focus on ASEAN, and we can see if we take a look, if we commit it to ASEAN, there will be a lot of watering down ideas, including at the end, our AOIP has no clear specific projects and without strong budgetary support. It has become, and then it confronts a lot of problems. Because yes, now China, US, and other countries are starting to acknowledge AOIP. However, there's still a lingering hesitancy of what it actually entails, right? So we can see that if we're really committed to Hatta, I think it's really important for us to appropriately use ASEAN and consider action beyond for achieving greater involvement in world politics. Yes, Indonesia can pull, I think, agential power and pragmatically project its foreign policy beyond. Indonesia leadership should manifest through multiple mediums and should not be fixated with ASEAN, especially on the issues that Indonesia really want their genuine idea upfront, rather than pass through dilution, watering down process. That's one. However, at the same time, I still want to argue that Indonesia can still utilize ASEAN, especially I think if you all would like to align with Hatta's idea of the perspective, Indonesia should promote the idea of social justice issues in Southeast Asia. Indonesia is still expected, I guess, to be the leader of the region. But we need to once again understand the limit and the context of ASEAN. I think the issues of migrant protection is really important. The issues of I think business and human rights, take an example, in ASEAN is still important. That's it, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Randy. I think that's very relevant because we can see. Thank you. I think we can see this very clearly that in the past, especially during the Cambodian case, Indonesia can aspire ASEAN to show its centrality. But with the current case, I think this is still very much question mark. And of course, it's part of the topic of the discussion later on. Now we move to the fourth speaker is Mr. Muhammad Arif, who is writing a chapter. This is a very interesting chapter compared to the other chapter, because this talks about implementing independent and active foreign policy in the critical moment when Indonesia had to swallow the bitter pill with the East Timor referendum. And in the beginning, we doubt whether we can really see the reflection of independent and active in this type of crisis situation. But I think Arif has written a very wonderful piece to explain that there is still a reflection of this principle in this critical moment. Arif, it's your turn now. It's 5 to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mbak Lina. Thank you again, RSIS and CSIS, for the opportunity. It is an honor to be involved in this project bersama dengan senior dan guru-guru saya. My contribution to this project, I would say, very modest. As Mbak Lina mentioned before, Habibie's administration is obviously not one of those cases that we normally look into when we want to talk about politik luar negeri bebas dan aktif. But at the same time, I think Habibie's foreign policy, especially with regard to East Timor, can show us a little bit about what bebas dan aktif entails. not only what bebas and active entails, but also how the principle has been understood by us, the observers, as well as the policymakers themselves. Therefore, what I can offer is just some reflections on how politik luar negeri bebas and aktif being understood and implemented in areas that are presumably not the traditional areas that the principle has been associated with, as well as how the principle works in the times of crisis. I did a short case study on the events leading up to the so-called popular consultation in East Timor in 1999. So it is about the decision-making process, not the referendum itself. And based on the case study, I have at least 3 takeaways that I would like to highlight. Number one, when we discuss politik luar negeri bebas dan aktif, I think there is an overemphasis naturally on certain elements while others are overlooked. And one of these overlooked elements is the value and the significance that Indonesian foreign policy establishment attaches to diplomacy, especially multilateralism, compared to other foreign policy instruments. In the case of East Timor, it was highlighted by the persistence to find the so-called internationally acceptable solution to the problem of East Timor through the process initiated by the United Nations. So I think it's not an exaggeration to say that diplomacy and multilateralism are parts of the DNA of Indonesian foreign policy. The second element of the bebas dan aktif that I think is often overlooked is the decision-making process itself. So bebas in this sense should be understood as independence in the decision-making, free from external interference rather than the policy outcomes itself. In the case of East Timor, it was best, I think, shown by the events surrounding President Habibie's decision to come up with the option to hold the popular consultation and really open the possibility for the separation of East Timor. As we might all know, the infamous letter from the then Australian Prime Minister John Howard plays a very important role in triggering the rethinking on the part of President Habibie regarding how to handle the East Timor problem. While affirming Australia's support for Indonesia's sovereignty over East Timor, the letter, which was apparently considered a blatant intervention into Indonesian foreign policy making, led to President Habibie to say enough and come up with the referendum proposal in East Timor. So in this regard, I think there is an academic calling for me and also to my colleagues, I think, to explore more about the Indonesian crisis decision-making and the role of the leaders' idiosyncrasies and personalities and beliefs in the implementation of bebas dan aktif principle. And finally, I think for me, this is the most important point, is that I think we should discuss more, study more, and expect to see more of politik luar negeri bebas dan aktif being implemented in all sorts of areas of foreign policy other than the traditional ones. If indeed there is a national consensus that bebas dan aktif is the overarching guiding principle of the whole Indonesian foreign policy, should not we expect to see more of it being implemented in all sorts of areas of foreign policy other than the traditional ones? So bebas dan aktif not only in terms of Indonesia's policy towards great powers or Indonesia's contribution to UN peacekeeping force, for example, but also bebas dan aktif in trade policy, bebas dan aktif in defense cooperation, bebas dan aktif in sustainable development, in climate change, in gender equality, and so on and so forth. And I think, yeah, we expect to see more, we expect to observe that bebas dan aktif is also being implemented in these areas. Otherwise, I think we might need further debate and discussion and more edited volumes on how we should understand bebas dan aktif principle. Thank you, Lina.
Thank you, Arif. I think that's a nice segue there to give the floor to the last presentation. Last but not least, of course, from Fitriani, who wrote the piece on Between the Two Digital Reefs. Basically, this article shared with us the argument about how a more forward-looking implementation of independent and active, whether this principle can be still reflected for it by Indonesia in dealing with the new type of threat, which is the digital threat. With that, Fitri, also 5 to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you for the opportunity, Dr. Lina Alexandra. I hope I unmute myself now. As mentioned, I would like to share my paper, my chapter on the new type of rowing between the two reefs. It's a question on the relevance, and if we wanted to make the independent and active foreign policy doctrine relevant, what should we do when we are faced with the new situation of more contemporary digital setting? As we all knew, the development of ICT has significantly impacted country security that calls for global government to foster safety and security in the cyberspace. Unfortunately, with the great power competition intensifies, conflict in the realm of cyber and digital is now more likely. In this situation, Indonesia needs to find its voice to translate and its relevance to come out with the new independent and active foreign policy doctrine. In this case, have identified 3 challenges that Indonesia face in actually making its position relevant. First, there is a challenge of the overlap mandates of the governmental body formulating cyber diplomatic strategy and who is in the forefront of the execution, who's doing the diplomatic meetings and organizing Indonesia face in the digital settings. The second, the issue of the ownership of infrastructure. As we all know, the majority of Indonesia ICT resource and infrastructures is in the hands of the private sector, and therefore the role of government is limited. And lastly, there are issues of unfinished drafting of necessary ICT regulation that makes it difficult for Indonesia to actually have its national footing on digital and ICT issues that makes it Indonesia having a difficulty on articulating its position internationally. Having said that, how could we respond when the time of Indonesia ability and position and relevance are being tested? For example, currently Indonesia have not able to comment on the issue of cybersecurity and the issue of where should we put our capacity development and resilience going forward. So in proposing to maintain the relevance of this independent and active foreign policy, Indonesia can do 3 things. First, to articulate an assertive response. What does it mean? First, Indonesia take a firm action in stating its position in order to foster an open, free, safe, and responsible cyberspace. Second, Indonesia should be able to defend itself from external digital threats, not making itself dependent of the two reef, which is now the US and China digital giants. And thirdly, showing assertiveness through intellectual and diplomatic leadership in cyber fora. Indonesia have done so in the many meetings of the United Nations groups of government experts, the open-ended working group in the field of cyber, as well as Internet Governance Forum and the global forums of cyber expertise. The second, Indonesia can pursue an active collaboration with like-minded countries, especially with middle power that still grapple with the issue infrastructure of ICT, and as well as foster dialogue to ensure the safe and secure cyberspace. The third and most important is to define the long-term agenda of what Indonesia would like to achieve in this digital space. It would be beneficial for Indonesia to define its long-term strategic goals in the cyberspace and cyber diplomacy especially. This can be done with the discussion in the long-term RPJM MP, for example, I have my timer on, so I don't go over time. So that Indonesia would have known itself and how it will position itself in the discourse of this of a digital diplomacy. Thank you very much for your time. I return to Dr. Lina Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Fitri. I think there's still a lot of works to be done to reflect independent and active in this, in facing this new type of threat for the country. Now, without further ado, we are very privileged to have two discussions today to the book. I would like to give the floor to the first discussant, Dr. Yayan Ganda Hayat Mulyana, currently the head of the Foreign Policy Strategy Agency in Indonesian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Without further ado, Pak, please, 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you, Pak.
Thank you, Ibu. Through you, Ibu, let me start by extending my appreciations to CSIS for having me to be discussing here. And I recognize the presence of my guru, Bapak Hasan Wirayuda. Thank you, Bapak. It's such an honor to meet you here. Of course, my distinguished colleague, Bapak Leonard Sebastian, who is now in Singapore. Let me also use this opportunity to congratulate all the distinguished writers and of course the distinguished editors. The collections of writings presented by younger generations of IR and foreign policy scholars, I think it's an excellent project, Ibu, collaborations between CSIS and RSIS, and I feel very old here among these younger generations of, and of course, let me recognize as well the presence of my guru as well, Bapak Rizal Sukma. I feel very honored to be here. Let me frame my comments on the chapters of the book by linking the principles of bebas aktif with the 8 dimensions of the foreign policy. First, the linkage between the principles and the intellectual and moral underpinnings of the doctrine of the principle. I believe that every doctrine, every foreign policy principle have the origins of moral and intellectual underpinnings. And Ibu Halida has nicely discussed the moral underpinnings that Bapak Muhammad Hatta ingrained within the ideas of active and independent foreign policy, from equality to emancipations, and within Hatta's thinking, and the persistence of nonviolence, and many others. And we recall even in the same time, the United States was startled with the emergence of the Cold War, and President Truman was having no idea in what ways the United States had to respond. But a young man from the Embassy of the United States in Moscow wrote an intellectual expositions on the conduct of Soviet Union through 12-page telegram and sent to Washington, and it became the intellectual underpinning of the Truman Doctrine, responding to the Cold War of the time. And second, let me link as well the principles to the context, and all principles presented or pronounced by policymakers always has a context. And during the Hatta's time, it was the period where domestic dynamics was highly connected with transformation occurring at the external environment, especially the emergence of the Cold War. It was, if I may borrow Bapak Hasan terms, it was an intermastic that shaped the course of the newly born republic, and ultimately it was a powerful context that created an impetus for the pronouncements by Hatta on the living doctrine of bebas aktif foreign policy. I think the chapter by Pak Ahmad Umar nicely touched on the linkage between the internal and external dynamics of the time. But probably, if we look at other presidency, I would like to see more in the books, the discussions, both the intellectual and the moral underpinnings. And of President Sukarno, for example, or President Suharto, and many other presidencies, and also more discussions on the dynamics of the contact and the linkage between the domestic and the international milieu. And the third one, let me link the principles with the definitions of national interest. I agree with Umar, with Pa Umar in his book on page 27, that foreign policy should be based on a comprehensive understanding of national interest. And national interest can be divided into vital interest and contextual interest. Today, for example, Indonesia's contextual interest is to expedite the economic recovery and to tackle the COVID-19 in expeditious and effective way. And of course, we have perennial vital interests as outlined within the fourth preamble, the preamble part of the constitutions. And let me now link the principles with the policymakers of the presidency. Presidency is quite unique from one generation to another generation. Some presidents had long before assuming the responsibility as the president, had been exposed to international relations. This morning, I had a discussion with Ibu Halida, how young Hatta had been exposed to international relations and to get a sense of the importance of international order, for example. If you look at the kata-kata, if you look at the words of the Tatanan Dunia enshrined within the alinea keempat, the four paragraphs of it reflects the fine understanding of Sukarno and Hatta and the leaders of the time of how they had been exposed to the international relations. And I recognize that Pak Karim's is talking about Abdurrahman Wahid era, Pak Yohanes and on Sukarno, and Pak Muhammad Arif on Habibie, Bu Anggun on Pak SBY, and Pak Klaus Ardhitya on Jokowi. I think we need someone to speak about Ibu Megawati as well, in more elaborate. Here we had Bapak Hasan Wiraida as the Prime Minister at the time. A lot of innovations of foreign policy within the context of the foreign policy bebas aktif during Ibu Megawati. And that is the presidency. And the fifth one is linking the principle with the tools or instruments. And on the table, we have a number of foreign policy instruments, from diplomacy to development aid, technical assistance, cultural missions, sanctions, and the use of military. Perhaps we need more discussions from one presidency to another presidency, in what ways that diplomacy had been fully utilized and in what way that it has been less utilized. For example, military, the instrument of military could be used for peaceful purposes. During President Sukarno under UNEP, for example, in 1957, we sent almost 600 contingents to Sinai for the UN peacekeeping operations, and in the later presidencies, the instruments of military for the peaceful purpose had been very essential as fostering Indonesia abroad. And six, linking principles with strategies and tactics. Within the principles of the doctrine of bebas aktif, it allows the creations of innovations of conceptual tools. For example, during Bapak Hasan Wiraida, we recognized the idea of intermastic, the idea of total diplomacy. And we have the idea of course, during Bapak Jokowi, we have the idea of maritime fulcrum. We have the idea of archipelagic foreign policy, and of course, the idea of millions friend and zero enemy and dynamic equilibrium. What I just want to say is that the doctrine really opens a room for the creations of more tactical more operational concepts, which is of course based on I discussed as well with Ibu that in what ways that Bapak Hatta as well envisions the non-aligned movement, the non-aligned conceptualization during his time. And the second one is linking the principles with the impact, in what ways that we can measure the impact of each implementations of independent and active foreign policy from one presidency to another presidency. And the last one, let me link the principle with the future. In what ways that our independent and active foreign policy could help Indonesian proceed to the Indonesia Emas in 2045. I think what strength that it will bring in navigating a more complex with more black swans and the unknown unknowns coming up in the coming years. And let me add for some points here. On foreign policy literacy, I think it's important to improve Indonesia's foreign policy literacy. Pak Evans and Ibu Lina in the book quoted the Law Institute survey that only 25% of ordinary Indonesians have ever heard of the Bebas Aktif foreign policy. Now, Bebas Aktif has been 74 years, Ibu, and I think we can collaborate, Ibu, to promote this foreign policy literacy. And the foreign policy establishment, I think we need more discussions on within the foreign policy establishment, the interaction and the interlinkages between stakeholders and the dynamics that they created. There are more players in the past 10 years. I recognize during Bapak Hassan Wirayuda, the role of non-government organizations become more and more greater and greater. But during President Suharto era, there's no such thing as NGOs or non-government organizations as part of the foreign policy establishment, the evolutions of the stakeholders. And another one is we need to discuss more on the legal dimensions of foreign policy, Ibu. We have, of course, law number 37, 1995. Article 3 of the law says a politik luar negeri menganut prinsip bebas aktif. And let me conclude by we need also discussion on the diversifications of diplomacy as primary tool of politik luar negeri. During Bapak Hassan Wirayuda, we had the human rights diplomacy, interfaith diplomacy. Now we have development diplomacy, we have health diplomacy, and we have vaccine diplomacy, Ibu. I think we need to look at, for every presidency, in what ways that the choice of diplomacy as instrument has evolved into a more specific diplomacy, and in what ways that it can still be maintained as the domain of diplomacy. Other choices of instruments like sanctions, and within the war of sanctions, and in what ways that we can see the implementations of independent and active foreign policy. The very last one, Ibu, on the sub-state role in international relations, how local leaders and local governments interpret and implement politik luar negeri bebas aktif. There are two undang-undang nomor 32 tahun 2004 on pemerintah daerah, and Undang-Undang Number 37 and 1999 that recognize the role of local governments in conducting international engagement, and they need to be apprised in terms of the meaning of independent and active foreign policy. Thank you so much, Ibu. Thank you very much. My apology, I have been exceeding the time we allocated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Yayan. I think very comprehensive inputs to all of us, and hopefully that can inspire the second book of Indonesia's foreign policy in reflecting on this independent and active principles. Now, last but not least, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Sylvia Yazid, the lecturer in the International Relations Department from the University from the Universitas Katolik Parahyangan. Please, Ibu Sylvia, 5 to 7 minutes for your comments.
Okay, am I audible, Ibu?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for the honor. Receiving the email asking me to discuss this book and receiving the soft copy of the book, I was really excited. I mean, like I grew up with this concept during my study time, and what struck me the first time is when I read the title, Hatta and Indonesia's Independent and Active Foreign Policy. I mean, like the word "and," it can be interpreted in different ways. Why not Hatta's Independent and Active Foreign Policy? But I would like to assume that because now we see the independent and active foreign policy as something that we own together as a nation. I see Bung Hatta, that's how I knew him, like knew as in the literature that I learned when I was still in school. He is a person who is exposed to the wide world of thoughts while still rooted to the local context. And that's why when you Google his name, for example, he, besides this independent and active, he is also associated with democracy and cooperation. And I think that value surveys in all the chapters, the democracy value. And since I can speak Minang, so democracy in Minang version is bule aia de pambuluah, bule kato de mufakat. So it means that micro political identity should not exist. That's the idea. And efforts is important, and external influence should be considered. So that's what I see as parts of the thoughts, the process of thinking. So as a person, I went through the period of the process of being proud that Indonesia is independent and active. And then I have to be honest that during university, we went through this evolution of independent and active is just bukan ini dan bukan itu. I have to confess that we had that thought as students. But after reading this book, I went through another stage, seeing it from a different point of view. I really enjoyed the book. I actually have 21 slides, but because I only have 5 minutes, so I just want to share my experience with you in going through the chapters. So I want to put myself in a position of a reader who went through the book, the draft, the script during the weekend. And I want to share what caught my attention. So let me just begin. Ibu Halida, thank you very much for sharing the experience, the reflection from the family. I really enjoyed that, and I'm inspired by that. When you decided to choose some keywords to reflect the thoughts of your father, and when you discuss about jangan seperti inlander, and then I interpreted it as sovereignty and empowerment. I might be wrong, but I hold the privilege of being a reader to interpret based on my background. But also keeping your promise, stay true to your words, and also collaborator. Thank you, Ibu, for sharing that with us, the reader. And for the introduction, Mbak Lina, I don't really know how much was it about you, but I know F1, and I would say that it's straightforward and provocative, and I enjoyed it. Reality is sometimes bitter or it hurts, but that's what we are facing now. It is not about who are behind the policies, but what the policies are about. I think that's what both of you are trying to convey. The more we insist that it is still relevant, the more we realize that it might not necessarily be the case. So that's why we need to be critical about it. So that's what the questions that you pose really set the basis for the discussion. And Mas Ahmad Rizky, I believe that when we start something, we need to have the same understanding of what we are talking about. And looking back to 1948, thank you for taking us to that era. And I agree that terminologies are best understood within the context. And then, as you said, contextualize. So we need to assess we also need to assess the long-term implications of policies. I agree with that fully, Mas Rizky. And Mas Yohanes Sulaiman, domestic politics, this is when democracy comes back again, pragmatism. And I like the part when you say that independence should not mean alone, and engagement is center to this idea. Mbak Dita Liliansa, the uniting of an archipelagic state. And I'm provoked by the statement, enjoying the process rather than aiming for the result. I don't want us Indonesian to be famous for this, but we have to accept the reality that in many times we do enjoy the process, and we don't want to be caught in the never-ending efforts. We have to come to the finish line at some point. Mas Arif, thank you for, I appreciate your courage to discuss this. This is when democracy and unity were tested, I believe so. And this is when efforts from Indonesia to be or to look more democratic. And the question is, might it interfere with our foreign policy? The efforts to look more democratic. The context and actors might change, but in time of crisis, presidents' idiosyncrasies and domestic politics prevail. I like that part, Mas. We still need to acknowledge that we look up to models, role models. So that's what the future might still hold for us. Mas Faisal Karim, minilateralism. Encouraging something out of the box. This is also Gus Dur's way. Berani beda in Indonesia. Hopefully, this continues to exist in Indonesia for the sake of creativity, including in foreign policy. The next one is Anggun, a colleague. I know her, and I can see her in the writing about. Bali Democracy Forum. I had the privilege of coming to the forum, and I met Bapak Hasan Wirayuda there. And she said something about we need to continue leading the promotion of democracy. But can Bali Democracy Forum bear this task? She questioned the indicator of success. She questioned whether active learning and lesson sharing is happening in the process. And she also warned that there is a risk of being used to preserve authoritarianism. But I would like to underline what she argued about being inclusive. How do we define being inclusive? I mean, Bali Democracy Forum has been expanded to include more and more stakeholders. So the question is, do we recruit more countries or do we recruit more stakeholders? So that might be the homework for Bali Democracy Forum. Yere and Klaus, allow me to say something about this. I like the part when you say the language of law and diplomacy are more independent than the language of power. That is something that a takeaway from your chapter that I underline. It is not a trend. It is pick and choose. What do you think? I would like to discuss that more with you. And also, when economic and technological dependency exists, does it mean that independency is compromised? I hope that I can meet you in the near future and discuss about this. Mas Randy, well, ASEAN, hello, Mas. We should meet
Okay, I
sometime.
think Ibu Sylvia experienced some technical
Am I still audible? Yes. Okay. Yeah. My question is, Mas, do you think ASEAN is still a happy and safe or relevant playground for us? I can see the smile, Mas, but yeah, this we'll discuss later. So my takeaway from this chapter is, Mas, what is appropriate issue for ASEAN, and what regional mechanism is available for business and human rights practices. So how can we include this in the ASEAN mechanism? Mbak Fitri, I know you as somebody who is always looking at the future, looking forward, and what I see is US or China, or do we actually have the right and capacity to choose which passage to go through which reefs? So, or in short, do we have the right to choose, Mbak Fitri? But yeah, I agree. And as somebody who write a lot of policy recommendation, you said well-articulated policy, active collaboration with like-minded countries, and long-term strategic goals. Those three are really important. Thank you, Mbak Fitri. And then for Mas Adi, the conclusion, I just want to say, isn't wine supposed to be tastier when it's old? So the more you keep it, the better it is. I just want to say that it's not only Hatta at the end. It's also everything else. Context when it was born, context when it is implemented, context when it is adapted. They are important. It is the question is of relevancy. Domestic determine foreign policy, or can it be the other way around? Diplomacy is not necessarily directed outward. It's also often inward, including foreign policy. And I'm sure some of you might agree with me on that. So at the end, context is important. That's what I conclude from reading the book. In my time, 2000s, we call it policy environment, but I think we are familiar with context now. And leading is still what Indonesia should do. We need to regain the confidence. Some might say that Indonesia is losing it, but we do need to regain the confidence and actively participating. It might not be the priority. I think that's part of the discussion, but we do need to actively participate. And I think this generation today is quite far from Hatta's time. They know independent and active, but they might not know the context when it was formulated. So do we need to revisit the concept? And this book has definitely served some of the purpose. Now, for the book itself, I understand that you don't want, Mbak Lina and Evan don't want to make it based on chronological order, like not leader based, but I still see the chronological order in terms of showing the evolution of the idea. Of the concept. Thank you for doing that, Mbak Lina and Evan. And also, it's easy to read. The key arguments at the beginning of each chapter, it really helps. And my rector says hi. He is teaching foreign policy of Indonesia this semester, and he is waiting for the book to be sent to us. Thank you very much, Mbak Lina.
Thank you very much, Ibu Sylvia. All right, because of the time, probably I can only entertain one comment, very brief comment question from the floor, if there's any. Andrew, okay. And I would like to hear also Pak Hasan to give a very brief comment, Pak, later. Please, Andrew.
Thank you, Lina. Just after hearing all the presentations, my name is Andrew, CSIS International Relations Department. Just after hearing the presentations, I think my ultimate question is, so what is the active, independent and active foreign policy? So the book has used different terms to describe what it is. For example, it started with ideas, and then some authors mentioned it's a belief, and some authors even mentioned that this is a norms. So I think choosing the right conceptual lens can clarify how it actually influenced. Because, for example, there's a clear differences between believing that China will behave, benevolently, or will behave aggressively, and a belief that China will be actually socialized into a sort of ideas that we make. So this is a very basic question. What is this? Is this a belief or norm or
Okay, thank you.
something else? Thank you.
Thank you. Pak Hasan?
Thank you, Bu Lina. First, I commend the publication of this book by CSIS and appreciates the contributions made by those who write articles relating to Hatta's and Indonesia's independent and active foreign policy. Actually, the title of this book, Retrospect and Prospect, that's not so much discussion on the retrospect. I thank Abu Halida for sharing with us from his close interaction with Bapak Dr. Muhammad Hatta and his ideas about independence and active foreign policy. But to me, independence and active foreign policy is the essence of our values when, as a young nation, newly proclaimed struggles to maintain their independence, including in our struggle to, in diplomatic front, to gain supports and recognitions from the international community. Pak Hatta intelligently wrap up the formulations, the experience, I mean the history of our struggle for independence, including diplomatic front, in his speech at the Committee of National Indonesian Parliaments in that time, called KNIP, but also nicely written at the Foreign Affairs magazines in April 1993. I think we learn more about Pak Hatta's idea of independent and active foreign policy from the articles. So in retrospect, what is independent and active? As we learn from the experience of 5-year war of independence. Number one is that for our own survival, we cannot rely on someone else, not the US and its Western bloc, not also from the Soviet Union and Eastern bloc. We have to do our own. That's the principle of Mandirian, independence. Number two, that independent and active foreign policy contain basic values that's mandated by our constitution, namely independent as the inalienable rights of peoples. And for that matter, we are mandated to abolish the subjugation of peoples under live under colonialism. Number two, to secure our national interests. There is permanent national interest as contained in the constitutions, the preamble, all those 5 tujuan, the purpose why the republic was established, including the last part of the paragraph 4, namely to help create or establish an international order based on independence, abiding peace, and social justice. And that kind of tatanan dunia or world order as mandated by our constitution is not inexistent. That's the nature of active or of foreign policy. Then, so that's why I wish to see more in this matter of retrospect, to write more of history that of between 45 to 1950, which in the end produce is independent and active foreign policy. In prospects, again in retrospect, when Pak Hatta delivered his speech in that NIP, it was the same time when Berlin Wall was erected. It was at the heights of the Cold War. That's why people can easily interpret it non-aligned, excuse me, free and independent foreign policy as non-aligned. It is no, it's not. And also people would easily interpret independent and active foreign policy as neutral. Pak Hatta nicely wrote in his piece at the Foreign Affairs that more or less saying, do we have only to choose between A or B, Western or Eastern Bloc? Don't we have our ideals, interests that we have to pursue on our own? Not simply siding with A or B or neutral. Even neutral is not positive. In 1955, the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, said that neutrality is immoral. So you can imagine if we choose to be neutral, on the other side, they would see us as immoral. And independent and active foreign policy is not that we are neutral. On the prospect, many questions because the Cold War ended in 1989. That's why no longer that any countries choose between Bloc A or Bloc B. And for that matter, consider that independent and active foreign policy is no longer relevant. It is irrelevant. Some of my senior in the foreign ministry, diplomats also questions whether independent and active foreign policy is still relevant. To me, it's still relevant because we are not simply choosing A and B, but we have our own ideals, purposes, interests to pursue. Then on the question of relevance of irrelevance, independent active policy are just simply ideas. It's not simply dream, but as principle, it is contained, as Pak Yayan said, in the Undang-Undang Hubungan Luar Negeri. There we see, or those who say that it's irrelevant, and to change the nature, basic foundation of Indian policy, change the law on foreign policy, which I think it will be very difficult. One important elements in the law on foreign policy, in particular on independent and active foreign policy, it is described the very character of independent and active. Now, number one is that we have to promote a very principled policy. What that means? All those basic values in our constitution must be secured. For example, on the Iraqi war in 2003, we made a very strong and principled statement. We strongly condemn the United States. Who dare in the world to condemn the United States? We did. Strongly condemn that it is a military aggressions against the Charter of the United Nations and principle of international law. And for that matter, we demand the Security Council, according to its mandate, to restore peace and security. 5 days later, Colin Powell called me to lobby for Indonesia to support the US invasion. I said, I'm sure by now you have heard a very principle that Indonesia's government and people, in fact, has made it public. And I said that it's not only the position of the governments, but also the people. And as in the process, in the democratic process, you know what Colin Powell said? Excellency, I understand. Let as democracies we agree to disagree. That's one of the character that as matter of principle, we can say no. That was underlined by Lavrov when I met him in 2007 on the margin of the APEC summit in Busan. I met him for the first time and he told me that I spent more than 10 years in the US. To me, Indonesia is one of the very few countries who can say no. And that's Indonesian active, independent and active foreign policy. I think I ended.
Thank you so much, Pak Hasan. Very inspiring comment. Okay, just very quick response to the question from Andrew Yere, probably from the young perspective, very quick, just very quick.
Okay, thank you, Mas Andrew. Mas Andrew is actually putting forward a very important questions, but I think scholars and practitioners can have different arguments on this, of course. But I think you know, somehow if we can somehow make a research on decision-making process in Indonesian foreign policy, for example, asking the diplomats or top foreign policy makers, or even stakeholders who are involved in the foreign policy makers, if we can just ask them during they make the policy, do they evaluate their decisions or their discussions to the extent to which, like, did I just apply independent and active foreign policy in making a particular foreign policy decisions? And if we can somehow have an access to that, then I think we can have an answer whether it is a norms, whether it is a belief, strategic culture, or whatever principles, values that guide Indonesia in making foreign policy decisions. So I simply do not have specific answers to your questions, but it is something very important that we can pursue in the next book project, maybe, Malina. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Okay. Well, with that, I think we have come to the closing of this book launch and discussion today. And before that, I would like to request just a symbolic handover of the book from the younger author, from the young experts, Indonesian foreign policy experts, to the foreign ministry here, and also definitely to the public. Please, Yere. Yeah, with that, we end this discussion and book launch, and hopefully this book will enlarge the Indonesian section in every corner of the bookstores, because I just read the Twitter this morning that one of the very famous bookstores in London, is only one section for Indonesia and 4 sections for the Vietnamese, and probably also for other South Asian. Hopefully this book will contribute more on Indonesia, views and about Indonesia's foreign policy. Thank you for your participation in this book launch and discussion, and hopefully you can join the next event of CSIS. Thank you. Thank you all the discussant and also speakers and authors. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lina, distinguished speakers and discussants for a fruitful discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we have finally come to the end of the event. On the behalf of CSIS Indonesia, I would like to give my deepest appreciation